Henry Miller always knew that he wanted more out of life. He dreamed of wealth, respect, and success. In his dreams, he saw himself surrounded by successful people in expensive suits who were discussing business deals rather than gas bills. He wanted to have a car with shiny details, gold cufflinks, and walk around the city at night, feeling like the master of this world. But so far, his life has been completely different. He worked for Jefferson Mutual, a small insurance company. It smelled of ink, dust, and old cologne. His desk was old and battered, and he rubbed it mechanically with his finger. On the table was a worn folder with contracts, yellow papers, and a phone with a heavy handset. A clock was ticking on the wall, as if mocking him. "Miller, the client is here," Johnson, his colleague, shouted lazily from above. He wore cheap ties and chewed gum so loudly that I wanted to kill him. Henry put on his trademark smile, which has already become his calling card. He realized a long time ago that there is no place for doubts in his work, because clients, like dogs, feel them like real fear. "Mr. Reed," he said, extending his hand to the older man who sat down across from him. "I'm glad to see you. You won't regret coming." When Henry was selling insurance, he wasn't just offering customers a piece of paper, he was giving them hope. He convinced everyone that this policy would make their lives better and safer. And he also convinced himself that this was just a temporary occupation. That one day he would walk out that door and never come back here. A house that smells of pies. After work, he found a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood. It was small but neat, with a white fence and a manicured lawn. There was also a neighbor's dog who was always chasing the kids. There was a cozy lamp burning in the kitchen, and Henry was already looking forward to opening the door and inhaling the aroma of vanilla, sugar, and cinnamon. Helen baked pies on Wednesdays. She said Wednesday was a boring day and needed to be sweetened with something. Helen greeted him in a snow-white apron. Her cheeks were slightly flushed from the heat of the oven, and her smile hadn't dimmed over the years. "How was your day, dear?" "What is it?" she asked, straightening a stray curl. Henry took off his jacket and hung it carefully over the back of a chair. He inhaled the aroma of fresh pastries and froze for a moment. But there was no previous pleasure. "Fine," he replied. They had dinner. We discussed the weather, the neighbors, and the latest news. Helen said that Mrs. Hughes was having another tantrum in the supermarket, and old Mr. Davis had finally fixed his lantern. Henry nodded, trying to look interested. But his thoughts were far away. That evening, as Henry was about to leave, his boss, Mr. Lawrence, suddenly tapped him on the shoulder. "Miller, you have talent," he said, lighting a cigarette. "I'm watching you. I want to introduce you to someone tomorrow. Be at the Gold Room by 8. Henry tried not to show how excited he was. Gold Room. He had heard of this place. Only their own people were allowed in there. They didn't just have dinner there, destinies were decided there. Contracts, deals, dating, it all started with cocktails, whispers, and well-spoken words. "Of course, Mr. Lawrence," Henry replied calmly. That night, he couldn't sleep for a long time. Helen was sleeping next to him, curled up like always. Henry stared at the ceiling and thought, "This is my chance." But he didn't know yet that his life would change forever there. Here is the second chapter, which continues in the same vein as the first. Chapter 2. The Gold Room. The following evening, Henry stood in front of the mirror, carefully adjusting the knot of his finest tie. His navy blue suit fitted perfectly, not overly expensive, but just right for the occasion. He ran his fingers over the lapels and picked up the silver cufflinks Helen had given him as an anniversary gift. From behind the bedroom door, Helen watched him with arms folded, barefoot and in a housecoat with her brown hair a little disheveled. Something in her eyes caught his attention, a cautious concern, perhaps a premonition. "Where are you going?" she asked, buttoning the last button on his jacket. He looked at her and replied, "It's a business meeting. A chance to make some progress." He hoped that his explanation would suffice. Helen nodded but did not move. "Don't be late," she said simply. Henry knew he would be, but he agreed. This was a place where destinies were decided. The Gold Room, as it turned out, was even more luxurious than Henry had imagined. Situated on the top floor of an exclusive hotel, the venue shone with golden chandeliers reflecting off glass tables where people sat. To Henry, they seemed almost unapproachable. All the men were dressed in expensive suits, smoking cigars and sporting confident smiles. The women wore silk dresses with smooth hairdos, long lashes, and delicate wrists adorned with sparkling diamonds. They laughed softly, lightly touching their companions' elbows or shoulders, as if to remind them they belonged only to them. In the air, the smells of whiskey, perfume, and cigarette smoke mingled. Henry knew this was no ordinary restaurant. It was a club, one you couldn't simply walk into. "Henry, over here," Mr. Lawrence called from the back of the room. Henry quickly crossed the floor, feeling eyes on him, appraising, cool, studying. He took a seat at the table, immediately noticing the woman across from him. Caroline Wells, the wife of Arthur Wells and the owner of one of the city's largest construction companies, was in her mid-30s and looked effortlessly stylish. With dark hair pulled back into a high hairstyle and red lips, she sat with a glass in her hand, lazily tracing its rim with her long, graceful fingers. She looked straight at Henry, not taking her gaze away from him as if she were examining something interesting. Lawrence introduced them. "Caroline, this is Henry Miller, one of my best employees. I think he has potential." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "Everyone has potential, Lawrence, but it's whether they know how to realize it that counts." Henry felt an unexpected excitement wash over him. He wanted to say something clever, but instead, he picked up his drink and took a sip, looking at her. Caroline smiled. The game had begun. At dinner, we discussed business, the real estate market, and investment opportunities. Henry listened intently, taking notes. He realized that these were people he wanted to impress. They would decide who would become rich and who would remain average. Caroline participated minimally in the conversation, but as Lawrence moved to the bar area, she leaned in closer. "How old are you, Mr. Miller?" she asked. 29, he replied. She nodded, slowly tracing the edge of her glass with her fingertip. "You are ambitious. That's good," she said. He responded, "There's no point in being in this city without ambition." She glanced at him for a moment longer than necessary. "Then you'll enjoy it here," she added. A shiver ran down Henry's spine. It felt like a map had been laid out before him with two paths, one leading to success, the other leading to mediocrity. Caroline smiled again, barely visible, from the corner of her lips. The game had just begun. Chapter 3. The Road of No Return, Chicago, 1954. Henry couldn't remember exactly how the evening in the Gold Room had ended. He recalled the clinking of glasses, Caroline's soft laughter, and the feeling that he had crossed some invisible line, but he wasn't sure where that line had been. Now, he found himself sitting in his office, staring at useless folders filled with policies, yet what he saw before him were not just numbers and signatures, it was Caroline Wells. He wasn't quite sure what had caught his attention. Was it her confident demeanor? Or perhaps the intense gaze she seemed to fix on him, studying him rather than just looking? Or perhaps it was simply the forbidden nature of the situation? Whatever the reason, one thing was certain, after that evening, he was never the same again. An unexpected encounter. Several days passed. Henry tried to push thoughts of her out of his mind. He continued with his work, smiling for customers, having lunch with Helen as if nothing had happened. Yet, everything had changed. When he left the office on Friday, Henry intended to walk to his favorite bar, but then he saw Caroline. She was standing by her black Buick Roadmaster, which was as eye-catching as she was. Her light coat, gloves, and immaculate hair made her look like a woman who knew what she wanted. "Mr. Miller," she greeted him with a smile. Henry's throat went dry. "Mrs. Wells," he replied, trying to hide his excitement. She tilted her head to the side and asked if he wanted a ride. He could have declined, but he opened the car door and got in. They drove through the city, gliding through evening traffic. Henry smelled her light and subtle perfume. "How are you, Mr. Miller?" "What is it?" Caroline asked without looking away from the road. "Like everyone who aspires to something more," he replied carefully. Caroline smiled. "And what do you need to achieve this, more?" Henry turned his head and looked at her. "Opportunities." She nodded. "Then maybe you should meet my husband. He loves helping young talent." Henry knew it was a trap, but he also knew he had already fallen into it. The evening didn't go as planned. She took him to the bar and didn't let him leave right away. "Henry," she said his name for the first time and he felt his heart racing. He looked at her. "Do you really want to succeed?" There was no flirtation in her voice, only a deep, serious question that couldn't be answered with a lie. "Yes," he said. Caroline looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. "Then perhaps you should learn to take risks." Henry opened the door and walked out. As the car drove away and disappeared around the corner, he realized that he had just made a decision that would change his life. Chapter 4. Dealing with Fate. Henry could not get her voice out of his mind. "You should learn not to be afraid to take risks." Those words stuck in his mind like a splinter. He understood that it was more than just a chance encounter, it was a challenge, and he did not know how to turn down the invitation. 2 days later, an invitation arrived in the mail. The envelope was expensive and cream-colored, with gold lettering, and inside was a card with a neatly written message. "Dinner at the Wells house on Friday at 7 p.m. We would like to see you there." There was no signature, but Henry knew exactly who was behind the invitation. His wife, Helen, found the envelope and asked, "Darling, who are the Wells?" "What is this?" She held the card in her hand, and Henry took it from her, trying not to reveal his excitement. "It's work. Apparently, one of our clients has introduced me to them." Helen smiled. "It's wonderful. The Wells. They say they have the most beautiful house in the city." The house is indeed beautiful. She didn't know that Henry wasn't thinking about home, he was thinking about Caroline. The house where secrets were hidden. Friday night. Henry parked his modest Chevrolet Bel Air at the massive gate inside. In front of him stood a house that seemed too big for one person, but perfect for power. The mansion was made of gray stone with columns and wide windows, illuminated by warm lights. The door was opened by a servant in a dark suit. "Mr. Miller? Come in." The inside of the house was even more impressive. The black marble floors reflected the light from expensive chandeliers and the walls were adorned with paintings in gold frames. The air was filled with the smell of cigars, expensive whiskey and subtle perfumes. Arthur Wells stood at the back of the spacious living room. Tall, confident, with slightly graying temples, Henry Miller stood next to Caroline. His suit was immaculate and he exuded an air of self-assurance that suggested he didn't need to prove himself to anyone. Caroline, on the other hand, was dressed in a tight, dark red dress and held a glass in her hand. Her gaze slid over him as if she knew something he didn't, making him feel uneasy. Lawrence, a mutual friend of theirs, introduced the two, and Henry shook her hand. He felt the strength in her grip, but also a lack of kindness. "I hope he meant well," Henry said with a smile. Wells chuckled. He said, "You're ambitious. And I like that." Ambition. It was a word that could open doors, but sometimes it could also close them. The dinner was sumptuous, yet Henry could barely taste the food as he sat across from Caroline. He tried not to let her gaze unnerve him, but it was difficult. After the main course, Wells spoke, pushing his glass aside. "I don't believe in accidents, Miller. If we're sitting here at this table, it means you have something I need." Henry looked up. "What is it?" Wells lit a cigar and squinted slightly. "Loyalty. The willingness to go the extra mile." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I need people who aren't afraid to do the dirty work for clean money." Something clicked inside Henry. That's it. A test. He looked at Caroline, who was watching without laughing or interrupting. Henry took a sip of whiskey and asked, "And what do you need me to do?" Wells chuckled. "Nothing yet, just think about it, you'll make the right decision. The decision that didn't exist." When Henry left the mansion, the cool breeze hit his face but couldn't calm his thoughts. He felt like he'd already crossed a threshold, even though he hadn't agreed to the offer. The scariest part was that he didn't want to turn back. Glava 5. The line that must not be crossed. After dinner with the Wells, Henry was in no rush to return home. He drove around the city, turning into an alley and parking near a cheap bar that he often visited on Fridays, thinking about more. Sitting behind the wheel, he gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "I need people who are not afraid to do difficult work for good money," he remembered Wells saying. Difficult work. Henry knew what Wells meant. He had met people like that, men in expensive suits with dirty hands. They had money and power, but they never had a choice. "Just think about it," Wells had said. As he thought, Henry watched Helen sleeping peacefully in the darkness of their bedroom. Previously, this view had calmed him, the tranquility of the house, the certainty that there was a place where he was needed just as he was, without conditions. But today, Henry was aware of only one thing: how far he and Helen were apart. The trap was closing. The next day, Henry was immersed in his work as usual: clients, documents, meetings. In the middle of the day, his secretary handed him a note: "Today, 2100, Chicago Plaza Hotel, Suite 1102, Caroline." He clutched the note in his hand. It was not an invitation, it was a direct command. When he knocked on the door of Suite 1102 at the Chicago Plaza, it opened immediately. Carolina stood barefoot in a black silk robe with her hair loose. The air smelled of expensive perfume and whiskey. "I thought you wouldn't come," she said with a smile. He entered and closed the door behind him. "You knew I would come," he said. She smiled back. "Yes." He looked at her, realizing that he had reached a turning point. One more step and there was no going back. Caroline came closer. "You've already decided, haven't you?" she said, running her fingers through his tie. She turned around and walked slowly to the bar to pour 2 drinks. "Arthur is never wrong about people," she continued. "He knows how to recognize those who are ready for change." Henry took a sip of his drink. Caroline stared into her glass as if she could read his mind. "You know you will agree," she said. He knew she was right. And she knew it too. Caroline put down her drink and took a step closer to him. "So why wait?" she asked. Henry didn't hesitate anymore. He took a step forward and embraced her. Glava 6. First duty. Henry could not remember how long he had been in the room. Flashes of a silk robe slipping across the floor, the taste of whiskey on his lips, fingers gripping his shoulders. When he opened his eyes, it was 3:47 a.m. Carolina was sleeping with her back to him, her breath even and calm, as if this was a familiar thing to her. Henry quietly got up, put on his shirt and went to the window. Outside, the city was awake, someone was always working, making deals, losing their last chance. He knew he was one of them now. Urgent assignment. When Henry returned home, Helen was already getting ready for work. She kissed him on the cheek briefly, as always. "Did you leave early? I didn't hear you come in." Henry smiled. "Urgent work, new client," he lied easily, almost without effort. And at 10 a.m., another envelope arrived on his desk. No name, no signature. Inside was a piece of paper with a brief message. 2000, the Velvet Club, find Harvey Lowell, tell him it's from Arthur. Henry entered the Velvet Club, a place known for its velvet sofas, perfect waitresses, and seductive jazz. When he arrived, he was immediately greeted by the scent of cigars and alcohol. At a far table, Harvey Lowell sat, short and with a swollen nose. He was wearing a worn suit and drinking slowly, as if waiting for something. Henry sat down across from him. "This is from Arthur," Henry said softly, handing Lowell a small brown envelope. Lowell looked up and asked, "Are you new here?" Henry nodded dumbly, not sure what to say. Lowell chuckled and said, "You still have time to back out." Henry didn't budge. Lowell opened the envelope, looked inside, and frowned. He looked back at Henry and asked, "Do you even know what you're getting yourself into?" Henry knew, but it was too late. After leaving the club, Henry felt like someone was watching him. He turned into an alley and took a drag on his cigarette, his hands still shaking. This job, this assignment, was a test, and he had passed it. Henry Miller was no longer just an insurance salesman, he was now Arthur Wells' right-hand man. There was no going back. Glava 7. Trust is measured in blood. Henry never thought of himself as a bad person. Ambitious, yes, willing to take risks, certainly. But he never imagined that one day he would find himself in an alley behind a club, cold sweat trickling down his back, knowing that he was being watched. He couldn't see who it was, but he knew those eyes in the darkness weren't just his imagination. Harvey Lowell's words rang in his ears. "Do you even know what you're getting yourself into?" Henry knew he couldn't turn back now. It was a test of his strength. As he returned to his office, the day was drawing to a close. He tried to appear calm, but inside, he was burning with emotion. By noon, there was a knock at his door. A man he had never seen before stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes that held no kindness. "Mr. Miller?" he asked. "Yes," Henry replied. The man handed him a folded piece of paper. "Tonight, meet me at the Grand Avenue Bridge parking lot. Alone." There was no signature on the note, but Henry already knew who had sent it. As he stood by his car, lighting one cigarette after another, despite tobacco no longer providing him with comfort, the wind blew from the river, chilling him to the bone. Minutes later, a black Cadillac arrived at the parking lot. Two men got out. The first was Arthur Wells. The second man, whom Henry did not recognize, was tall, heavy, and had a split lip, his hands clenched into fists. Wells calmly looked at Henry. "Glad you didn't make us wait," he said, lighting a cigar. Henry swallowed. "I want to know what this is all about." Arthur smiled. "A test, Henry. You passed the first one. It's time for the second." He turned to the heavy man. "Danny, tell Mr. Miller what you did." Danny looked away. Wells shook his head. "You see, this man owes me a lot of money," Arthur said, shrugging his shoulders. "He promised to pay it back, but..." Henry realized that he was being serious. "I gave him a chance, but words without actions are empty," Arthur continued. He then turned to Henry and said, "His fate is now in your hands." Henry felt cold as Arthur handed him a gun. "If you give me a reason to trust you, we can continue talking," he said. "Otherwise, we won't have any more conversation." It was a simple choice. Either Henry pulled the trigger or he was out of the situation. As he looked at the gun, images of his past flashed through his mind: Helen, their home, the insurance company, and his old life, including Caroline's words in the hotel room. "You already know that you're going to agree." And Henry knew he had to make a decision. With a heavy heart, he took the gun and aimed it at Danny. Then, without hesitation, he pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot was drowned out by the wind over the river as the body fell. Arthur smiled as Henry walked away. "Welcome back, Henry." The point of no return. When Henry arrived home, his hands were trembling. Helen was asleep. He sat on the edge of the bed and gazed at the wall. It seemed to him that he heard the sound of gunshots over and over again. But the most frightening thing was something else. He felt no remorse. Just emptiness. And that meant there was no going back. Glava 8. Masters of Deception. The night was dark and oppressive, like a heavy weight on my heart. Henry sat at the table, his face hidden in his hands. He knew what he had done couldn't be undone, but he couldn't imagine how quickly his life had turned in a different direction. Bang! That sound echoed in his mind, filling him with dread and regret. Danny's death was not just his first mistake, it was the culmination of his choices. Now, he was not just a salesman selling insurance, he had become a part of the underworld he had been trying to avoid. In the morning, Helen, as always, made breakfast. Her soft voice drifted from the kitchen. "You seem tired today, dear," she said when he walked into the dining room. Henry tried to smile, but it came out forced. "Trouble at work?" she asked, her eyes full of concern. "Is everything okay? You can tell me." Henry knew he could, but he didn't want to. He didn't want her to know the truth. "It's just taking time," he said, looking away. Helen nodded, but her eyes didn't leave his. The next step. The next day, Henry was called to Wells' office. He entered the room and saw Arthur talking to two men. They were both experienced, with serious expressions and piercing eyes. Wells turned to him and said, "Henry, it's good to see you." The men turned to look at Henry, as if they were assessing him. "These are Jeff and Rick," said Wells. "They will be working with you." Henry felt his heart race. "Everything is settled." Wells continued, "I've decided about Danny, and we need to move forward. We're planning an expansion. Our network needs to grow." "How does this affect me?" asked Henry, even though he already knew the answer. Wells' tone turned cold as he said, "You know what happened, and now you're in debt. We need to get what we're owed." One of the men, Jeff, nodded in agreement. "We need you to make contacts with the company where we will be getting the money from. This won't be easy." Henry felt a tightness in his throat. "I'm not sure if I'm ready for this." Arthur laughed. "You're sure you are? After what has happened, there's no other option." Henry looked at them, realizing he had fallen into a situation with no escape. An inevitable decision. After the meeting, he left the office feeling confused. Each step he took felt like a blow. He knew Helen wouldn't understand what was happening. She deserved more than this life. That night, as they went to sleep, he couldn't get comfortable. Helen slept next to him with a calm face. Henry imagined how things could be different. "A conversation needed, Helen," he said suddenly. She turned to him. "Yes, darling?" Quote. I need to tell you." She looked at him intently. "About what?" Henry hesitated, feeling the words catch in his throat as he spoke. "I have some things that could affect us, and I don't want to worry you, but..." Helen interrupted, her soft voice soothing. "Henry, you know you can tell me anything. I'm here for you." His heart pounded as if trying to escape, and he said, "I don't know what to do. I'm so confused." Helen held him close. "We'll figure this out together. You're not alone." The word, "together," felt like a knife, tearing at him from inside. He didn't want her to be involved. Next morning, Henry returned to the Velvet Club, knowing he needed to meet with Harvey. Decisions needed to be made. Inside, he was greeted with the familiar scent of cigars and jazz. Harvey sat at a table with a serious expression. "Let's talk," Harvey said as Henry took a seat. "About our past and what lies ahead." Henry knew they were now in this together. The only question was who would take over from whom. Chapter 9. Blind Trust. As Henry sat down at the table with Harvey, his mind was filled with chaos. Every sound and glance from other customers felt like a piercing stab to his senses. It was hard for him to distinguish between reality and paranoia. "You know what's behind this," Harvey said, pouring a glass of whiskey for himself. "Arthur doesn't forgive weaknesses." Henry nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "I know, and you need to be prepared that more than just promises will be required of you." The challenge of destiny. Henry realized it was time for him to make some decisions. He had no other choice. He had stepped into this world, and now he needed to discover who he was in it. "I'm ready," he said, although he wasn't sure. Harvey's eyes narrowed. "Ready? You don't even know what you're getting into." Harvey poured another drink, stared into his glass, and started to speak. "Wells is going to expand his business empire. We are planning to take a step towards removing power from the local leaders." Henry suppressed a shudder, realizing that these words could cost him his life. What is required of me? In this venture, you need to build trust. We will execute some deals, and you will need to go undercover. You need to enlist the support of people from the insurance company and persuade them to invest in our project. It's dangerous, Henry said quietly. Dangerous? That's exactly what we're paying for. Henry felt a surge of fear. He realized that by taking this step, he was entering a game he might not be able to escape. The dark side. When he returned home, Helen was already sleeping. But he could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, Danny's broken body and last smile stood before him, seeming to ask for forgiveness. You've already made your choice. Henry got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the city was bustling with life, but there was one thing on his mind, a dark premonition. The next day, he decided to talk to Helen. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had to. They sat in the kitchen. She was pouring coffee, her hands trembling. You didn't sleep well again, she said, looking at him with concern. Helen, he began, but his words caught in his throat. What's wrong? She asked. It's dangerous, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. She froze, her eyes wide with fear. Dangerous how? She asked, her voice trembling. Not just work, he explained. There are things I have to do that you don't know about. It could hurt us. She looked at him with pain in her eyes. We should have done this together, she said. His heart ached at the thought of hurting her. I'm sorry, he said. It's my fault. I should have told you. She stood up and walked away, tears in her eyes. He watched her go, feeling helpless. I didn't want you to suffer, he said, his voice breaking. Do you think I want to be here? I love you, Helen. He closed his eyes, trying to regain control. His phone rang, and it was Arthur. Henry couldn't ignore it. We have a meeting, Arthur said. Henry hung up and looked at Helen, who was crying. What's going on? She asked. Where are you going? None of your business, he replied, turning away. Helen stood up, tears in her eyes. Please don't go, Henry. You don't have to do this. But he knew he had to. He walked away, his heart heavy. At the Velvet Club, Wells was waiting for him. Arthur's eyes were full of determination. Ready? He asked. Henry nodded. It wasn't just any ordinary situation. It was a life or death struggle. And he was determined to do whatever it took to survive. Chapter 10. The Armistice. Chicago, 1954. The sound of the Velvet Club was deafening. Standing in the middle of the room, Henry felt the temperature rising around him. The men at the tables looked at him with interest and surprise. In the corner, Arthur Wells sat with confidence in his eyes. Henry realized that not only his fate depended on him, but also his family's. As Henry approached, Arthur said, You know what we need to do. We need to remove those who get in our way. Henry paused. A struggle raged inside him. If he took this step, he knew he would be part of a world he could never escape. Arthur, I have another idea, he said, trying to sound confident despite the emotions raging within. Wells raised an eyebrow, surprised by Henry's boldness. Tell me. We can make a deal, instead of resorting to violence. Instead of targeting our competitors, we can work together. Arthur, with your strength and resources combined with our connections at the insurance company, we can create a powerful alliance that will control the city without any bloodshed. Arthur considered it. Do you really think they will do that? If we offer them something of value, Henry replied. I am willing to meet with them. Give them an opportunity to avoid conflict, and it will earn us respect. Decision-making. There was silence in the room. The men exchanged looks, some were skeptical, not believing it could happen. Arthur stood up and approached Henry. And you think you can persuade them? Henry nodded. Yes, I can. I have experience in the insurance industry. I know how to bridge differences. The crucial step. Despite his inner fears, Henry felt this was his last chance. He could not run away from his mistakes anymore. A few days later, Henry arranged a meeting with the rivals of the local criminal organization. The situation had become tense, but he was determined to resolve it. As he entered the club, his heart raced in his chest. Influential people were sitting at the table, their gazes filled with skepticism. "I am here to propose a deal," he said, looking confidently at each of them. He explained his idea for a mutually beneficial agreement. Instead of conflict, they could unite to create a stronger and more sustainable business. Henry talked about the advantages that resources and connections could bring when they worked together instead of against each other. Initially, they were skeptical, but as he spoke, the tension began to lessen. "And you believe this will work?" one of the bosses asked. "Yes," Henry replied. "I believe we are stronger when we work together." In the end, they agreed to give his proposal some consideration. Little by little, the threat of violence started to diminish, and it became evident that they desired stability and benefits. The new reality. When Henry returned home, he felt as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Helen was awaiting him in the kitchen. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice quivering with excitement. Henry embraced her, smiling. "Better than I anticipated. We found a way to resolve the issues." "Are you serious?" Her eyes sparkled with hope. "Yes, we're on the path to peace." Conclusion. Months later, Henry had become a key player in the newly formed business. Rather than managing fear and violence, he now engaged in an enterprise that supported his family. Helen looked at him with pride, aware that they had overcome challenging times, yet now they had a future ahead. Henry realized that this was not merely a business, but his family and life. He was no longer the man who walked a dark road. Henry Miller had become a man who believed in peace, and his heart was full of hope. It was a new day in Chicago, and maybe this was just the beginning for him.